Now we're going to talk about the actual setup, the basic steps at which you'll need to do when you first turn on the system for the first time and be able to actually set up and control the motors that you've installed and the control switches. The first thing you have to do is get into the programming side of the screen. Default codes for every WindowMaster controller is 4321. We do have a installation manual PDF that has some key points highlighted. Your account manager can make sure that you have that in your possession as well. So the first thing we do is in the key in the bottom left, 4, 3, 2, 1, check mark. You may also get a pop-up that says you've logged into level 3. Depends what screen you enter the keypad in, whether that pop-up exists. So now once you're in the level 3, you can go into configuration. And the first place that you're going to start is the motor line. And that is the programming of the motors to the actual control panel. So this particular test table has 2 motor lines configured. We're going to look at our single motor configuration first, show you what it looks like. The first thing you need to do is set your output mode. Almost all motors that we use here at Solar are going to be motor link. So you're going to just go in here, select motor link. You can also use detect and it will find them. It just tends to be easier to use the motor link setting. It'll read through it quicker if it doesn't have to figure that out first. Then you can go into the expected number of motors. And I recommend just doing discover. It allows the system to run through and identify each motor. Hit check. So now you'll notice that this screen is showing it's an expected number of motors of discovering, and the expected number of locking motors is discovering. You can actually leave this screen, but you'll notice that it's not going to show green in the S1X1 configuration right now because we reset that search. It doesn't actually know that the state of the motors. So it can take up to 60 to 90 seconds for this process. When it's a single motor, as you see, it took about 30 seconds. But once you see this, you have the expected numbers of motors 1. As long as that's what you know is hooked up to the motor line, you're actually already done with the motor line configuration for that configuration. If you have a 2 motor configuration, if say it's a structure, ridge vent, and E-vent, I'll show you how to do that configuration as well. It's actually pretty much the same process. You're going to set your output mode to motor link, your expected number of motors. Same process. Go in, discover, and let it walk through that same process. It's going to take a little longer because if you remember in the actual setup instructional videos, we showed the parallel connection between the green. The green is a data wire on these. It is not a ground, as we've discussed. Those are what allow the motors to talk in parallel and give a data connection back. So what that wire is doing right now is it's telling the system how many motors are on that link. So now we came back, it found both motors, and this is also where we can assign the motor groups. It's my recommendation to you that if they are separate types of products, to give them a different motor group, even if you're going to control them from the same switch. It just allows the program to be a little more organized, and you'll actually still be able to share the inputs across multiple motor groups. In the case of this test table, the single motor link is on motor group 1, and this 2 motor is motor group 2. So in motor group, this is where you can configure your actual grouping rules. So motor group 1 is not a smoke zone group. We're not using smoke zones for most Solar Innovations projects. If you have that application, we can certainly help you. The actual status, it's green because there's no issue. The maximum position, meaning we allow these motors to go to 100%. So this is where you can actually set all of those configurations, the comfort maximum position, how long you want your motors to go open. Some of these settings are common in states that have window and vent opening maximums. Certain states say you can't open windows more than 4 inches or the size of a particular ball for various safety requirements. this is where you can actually set those maximum percentages to stay within your code requirements. So you can go through and set that. And then your wind position and rain position. So in this scenario, if the wind or the rain sensor triggers, the window is 0% open, so it will close. And especially in structure scenarios, it's not uncommon that you may still, temperature dependent, even in the rain, have your window open, say 10%, if it's a ridge vent that has a very high pitch that you might not have rain impedance with a small opening. But those settings can be changed in that motor group configuration. And remember, in the case of this system, motor group 1 is linked to motor line 1. That does not always have to be the case. Motor line 1 could be associated to motor group 3. So I recommend as you assign your motors to motor lines and motor groups that you do document which ones are in which grouping, because that's going to come up when you're setting up your local inputs, which we'll talk about next. Your local inputs are your different signals. So your toggle switches, or your thermostats, or your wind and rain sensors. We tend to, by default, use the X1.1 and 1.2 for our up-down. I'll show you that. We talked about it recently in the configuration, but you can see it's the S1 and the X31 and X32. So what we can do, so this is my open switch. So I'll show you what that looks like in configuration. The input type will by default be binary, but we have this to set to control the motor groups 1 and 2. So what that's allowing us to do is use one toggle switch to control multiple motor lines and motor groups. So we have a motor group 1, which has a single motor, and we have a motor group 2, which has motor line 2, which is 2 motors in parallel. So we end up controlling 3 individual motors through one toggle switch by adding groups 1 and 2 to a program. The active function is to open the motors. So this is commonly used, say the red-black got swapped somewhere in the field, and because the toggle switches are not polarity sensitive in any way, shape, or form, and you hit the switch you would expect to open the motors, and they actually try to close. You can actually come in and just reverse that in this screen. If I clicked open, I could just set it to close. You can also do comfort, change it to safety or comfort steps. One use for that is put a button in your controls that sets it to a safety percentage. So say, you're away from home, but you're okay with your window vent being open 20% when you're away. You could use the safety feature for something like that. And then down below, your active state is on. So your login can actually time out, which we just saw here. You can just go log right back in. You'll notice the pop-up came in. Now we'll go back to configuration and back to the local input. Sorry about that. And you can go back in and see your active state. And then from this screen, you can see all of your other controls. Your thermostats, for example. You can see the S1 just went green. That was a thermostat setting. You're always going to see one solid green icon when you have a thermostat turned on in your local input configuration. That's because the thermostat is in a constant state of signal. It's either telling the system it should be to its closed state, whatever percentage you have that set up in the motor group configuration, or it's going to be in the open state. So for example, right now, S1 4.1 controls motor groups 2. So we have this test table only doing the parallel motors through the thermostat, and it's closing it. So that would be the low temperature environment. If I actually move the thermostat over to a high temperature to open, you'll see that it switches to the other signal, and right now my motors are opening. Once the temperature switches to a low enough temperature to close, it'll automatically switch back to the closed environment. Again, not unlike the toggle switch, it's not unheard of for there to be a wire coloring change, and especially because there's not a lot of standard wire colors for this type of wiring environment. So you can actually end up just having to switch these if you use your thermostat and it opens when it should close and vice versa. In the configuration, you can just switch the open and closed on the terminals that they're wired to. The last configuration option is local output. It is something that we won't use in very many of our projects, but you may have an application on your own. The system has a couple default outputs. You'll notice none of them are actually set up even in our test table. But what these are is the X9 terminals, these ones that are not used up here. We can actually go in and give it a binary output or a siren if you want to use a bell. An example for that is sometimes if the motor group is open, you want to trigger a siren. But generally speaking, binary output is 99% of output use. Then you can select what motor group triggers that output. So if we wanted to use a control to tell something else to turn on, we would be able to say motor group 2, if it's open, yep, and on. So now that X9 point up here, if motor group 2 goes open, it's going to send a signal on that line. One of the things we see used for that that do come across our table on occasion is a circulating fan turns on when a window is in an open state. Especially in structures. So like if a ridge vent opened, you may turn on an exhaust fan as well. And this is where you would use that feature inside the panel. And that sums up the basis of the configuration. The weather station is one last topic we can talk about. If you have a weather station, the only thing you really have to do once you have it wired per the instruction manual is come in here, set the sensor type to the WLA340, and select Master Not Used. All the other settings are pretty industry standard. However, there are changes you can make in terms of how often it pulls the weathering station. By default, it's 2 per millisecond, which is normally more than frequent enough. But this is where you set that up. And if you have slave and master panel configurations, we do that in this environment as well. If you do get into a slave and master configuration scenario, your account manager will help walk you through those steps because it's a little more complex than a basic video. And then from there, you can go back to your home screen. Status hardware okay, everything's good to go.